So, dear guests, you are very welcome to the second session of today's conference, the session devoted to the implementation of our new directive into the national legal system. We have a very intense agenda. We will have the presentation of the national implementation on some very representative legal systems of the EU. We will start with France, we have then Greece, Italy and Germany, and then we will close the session with a more critical paper on the possible impact of this new directive on the art market. I'm very glad to be able to introduce you to our first speaker, Dr. Sophie Vigneron, who is a lecturer at the University of Kent since 2002, but has a French legal education, and she focuses her research since many years on cultural heritage. She wrote a book on auction law, which was awarded a prize in 2006. So, Sophie Vigneron, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we have slides? It's coming. Okay, so, well, before the slides come in, I'm not going to give you a general introduction of the directive because this was done this morning, so I'm going to cut to the chase and try to really focus on France. I suppose the implementation of the directive in France happened relatively quickly because the directive was implemented by a statute on the 20th of February 2015 without much discussion, because the reason was that this directive was implemented with two other directives on artist rights. The first one was Directive 2011-77 on the return of protection of copyright and certain related rights, and the second was Directive 2012-28 on orphan works, etc. It's not that interesting, but what the problem was that France was late in implementing those directives, in particular Directive 2011, and for this reason, the European Commission had already sent a letter of formal notice to France regarding the delay to transpose that Directive 2011 on the protection of copyright. So that's why the process to implement the directive was cut short, and there was not much discussion in Parliament regarding the implementation of the Directive 2014, as it was added to those implementation of those two directives that had already been delayed, and France could have had a fine of up to 10 million euros, according to the French Minister for Culture. So that's just, I think, as well of background, so that the directive was implemented, and there wasn't much discussion, and there wasn't much discussion in particular from the art world. So let's first take a look.
Yes. Sorry.
Stock? Okay, here we go. So, taking stock, how many cases of restitution were made to France? That's a very difficult question to answer, and I'm sorry I haven't got an answer to that question. What I can say is that there have been cases of restitutions that were made to France. Here you just have a few pictures, but most of those cases were returned to France, but without recourse to the directive itself. It's more an exchange between the OCBC. The OCBC is the Office Central, thank you, l'Office Central pour les biens culturels. It's the police branch that specializes on the trafficking of cultural objects. Okay, OCBC. So the OCBC works very closely with other European states, in particular Belgium. Most of the cases I found involved Belgium or the Netherlands. Sorry, not to name and shame. Some of them, those particular paintings were stolen paintings. So all the data I found were only regarded only paintings or sculptures or works of art that had been stolen and were registered as historic monument. So they were usually protected with the highest level of protection in French law, if you want. Why? Because it would be very difficult to find an object that was illegally exported by its lawful owner. And that's really what the directive is also about. So there's no cases I found about that. How many cases of restitution by France? Here as well, I haven't found many information. But what we found is actually the forfeiture by customs. So here we have two tables. That table 1 quotes the number of instances of seizure of cultural goods by customs. And you see there's certain numbers, 60, 70, but one instance of seizure can cover several cultural objects. So that's how I found until 2012. There was no number for 2013. And then we've found different table because here we have the number of cultural objects that were seized by customs. So customs suddenly has changed the way it gives its data from instances of seizure to number of cultural objects. So it's very difficult to compare. Particularly in 2014, you see here there's almost 400,000 of objects were seized. So it's a very high number compared to 2015. The numbers have just been released. And what happens usually in those cases was that customs, in agreement with the French Minister of Culture, will return the object to the country of origin if it's possible to identify. Okay, so that's more about illegal imports that have been seized by customs. So that's all the data I have at the moment. Also, I could add that some of those objects were also seized coming from countries outside of the EU. For example, Egyptian statues or Egyptian artifacts as well were seized by customs and were returned to Egypt. There was one instance of fragments that had been stolen in Egypt and bought by the Louvre, and those were returned by the Louvre as well, even though one could discuss really if the Louvre was in good faith when it purchased those items, but that's a different question. Okay, so what is to focus on the directive? What is the impact of the directive on French law? Here we have a summary, and I just want to pinpoint that's really no issues, and I'm not going to talk about it, just to mention that I'm not going to talk about it. First, the law was changed in order to update the vocabulary and the references from the European Economic Community to European Union, or regulation as well were updated, Article 30 to Article 36, member states to competent central authority. So that's not really problematic. The extension of the time limit as well, so from 2 months to 6 months, from 1 year to 3 years, etc. So that was done without question. The competent authority in France as well. So here it's the Office Central de Lutte contre le Trafic des Biens Culturels, OCBC. Merci. One question that was raised, should the French Minister of Culture also become a competent authority? So this has not been changed yet, but this could happen. At the moment, the competent authority is the OCBC. So two issues I want to focus on now is the first is the definition of national treasure in French law, and the second is due diligence in the civil code as well. So let's move on. The new definition of national treasure. What is interesting here, sorry, I'm catching up with my notes. Be sure. So what is interesting here is that the definition of national treasure has been changed, and you find here in Article L, which means law or legislation, loi, statute 111-1. So you can guess, it's not the first one because the first one is L1, but that's the second one, L111-1, Code du patrimoine, define national treasures. And this statute, this article is this section is very important because it's the cornerstone of the Cultural Heritage Code. And it defines exactly what is a national treasure according to the Cultural Heritage Code. So this section was changed and was updated with the implementation of the directive. And it was not, strictly speaking, was not necessary, but it was done in order to harmonize and unify this definition of national treasure within French law. Rather than wait, there's also a discussion of changing some part of cultural heritage law. So this is going on in Parliament at the moment, but it was thought that it wasn't necessary to wait for this statute that is still being discussed. It was better to do it as early as possible. So some style and editing sont des trésors nationaux. I'm sorry, I should stop speaking French because then I can't speak English properly. My apologies. So several codes, several sections. First, sont des trésors nationaux has been simplified and edited. It's a clear definition. It also has numbers. So what are national treasures in French law? Here you see all goods, that all museum artifacts. Musée de France is a very broad category that includes obviously French museums, but also museums that might be private museums, but that have been accredited and have a special status of French museum, if you want, Musée de France. This hasn't changed. Archives have become a standalone category and have been precised as well by this section 2, subsection 2. Registered artifacts, so with the category of historic monument, registered monument, that hasn't changed. What has changed is this number 4. It's a definition of other public goods. So that's a new category. It's all objects that are not historic monuments or that are not within museum collections, but that are in public ownership and have also historical, scientific, archaeological, or technical interest. For example, it can be a piece of furniture or paintings that could be found in the Parliament or in the Elysian Palace or in other state buildings that are not particularly protected or that were not included in the category of national treasures, but that obviously are national treasures. So that's also important. And finally, category 5, which is obviously about potential national treasures. So those treasures that might be in private ownership and that need a certificate in order to be exported. No change that was already in that definition before. So an improvement with a better definition of national treasure, that's the first thing about the implementation of the directive. The second point of the directive is actually the notion of due diligence and good faith in French law. What has changed? In French law, in the civil code, good faith is presumed. So it is actually for the original owner or the claimant to prove that the possessor was of bad faith, meaning knew that his behavior did not comply with the law. This is a question of fact that was assessed by the judge according to several criteria that you might be familiar with: price paid, quality of the object, means of payments, etc. So this section L2012-8 of the Cultural Heritage Code implements the directive word by word. This hasn't been changed at all, except maybe for the fact that this article mentioned the possesseur de bonne foi qui a exercé la diligence requise. So interestingly enough, we still find this good faith possessor, though that French, they do like good faith, So they couldn't really let it go. But they mentioned la diligence requise. So that really is obviously the due diligence proved by the possessor. That's important. Question of fact, character of the parties, etc. What is interesting is that I went through the parliamentary debates and not much was criticized. Some MPs mentioned, all MPs were, yes, cultural heritage needs to be protected. Yes, something needs to be done. Oh, French law, civil law is going to be changed, but they're actually not lawyers. They don't really know what it means. So, oh yes, these could cause problems. But yeah, it doesn't matter. Let's vote yes. And they all voted yes unanimously. So here we go. So what does it change? Well, we have, you see, I'm going to use my Latin, speciala generalibus derogant. Do not forget that this section is actually a special statute that really applies to a particular situation. So that statute will be applied to only objects that have been illegally exported, and the civil code will still be used for all general law. But what is interesting, nevertheless, is that it is possible, and maybe it is hopefully it will happen, that the judge, while examining bad faith, will also refer to some case law that will arise from this section. So there will be cross-fertilization between the two, and this is to be hoped. And finally, to conclude, I read the art newspaper, it's such a rich source of news, and here we go, look at that. Is that going to be the next 100-year war between the UK and France? The Ring of Joan of Arc was bought by one of the Gaëtan Favereau, who is, maybe you have heard of the Puy du Fou in France? The Puy du Fou? Yeah, it's a quite famous attraction in France. It's a famous attraction where they do, reconstruct battles from the Middle Ages. Well, anyway, and it's also sponsored by Philippe de Villiers, who is kind of far right, well, right, for whatever, towards the right, if I can say. So Marine Le Pen is extremely happy that Joan of Arc's ring is back in France. The problem, though, was that this ring was bought, right, sorry, it should read 2016, okay, in the UK, so recently, imported in France. It is now in France because, I quote here, Gaëtan Favreux has touched the ring and says it probably has an export license. So I don't know, maybe we can ask our colleague from DCMS if that is true. But could that be a real test case for the directive if the OCBC is asked by DCMS to investigate? OCBC could seize the local court, the TGI, Tribunal de Grande Instance, and ask this court to take precautionary measures for this ring not to disappear or be damaged. I don't think it would damage, but maybe it would disappear. And then DCMS could sue Puy du Fou, Espérance Fondation, because one question that would be asked, has due diligence covers export certificates inquiries. That has been exported, so that's from the 16th of March, so it's less than a month. Obviously, an export certificate from the CMS, even though they're very, very quick, it's Arts Council. Even if they're very quick, they're not that quick, so it's doubtful. So, and finally, obviously, the question that would be also an interesting question is when we talk about the definition of national treasure, is this an English national treasure or is that a French national treasure? Or could it be both, actually? Because this ring apparently has been in the UK since 1500, so quite a long time. But, Joan of Arc is an icon of France, so who knows? Sorry, I don't want to start a new war, but there we go. We might see what happens next.
Thank you very much, Sophie.